The gaming world's attention has been focused on one game this month, actually two games. Kingdom Hearts 3 is also a big game coming out this month, but for the sake of the video, saying one game sounds way better, and the Resident Evil 2 remake has so much anticipation going into it that it's actually really surprising to me. Not to say that Resident Evil hasn't been this long-running franchise that's very popular, but the anticipation for this Resident Evil 2 remake is far exceeding the anticipation of any other Resident Evil title in recent memory, and maybe that's because Resident Evil games have been a little bit hit or miss, especially with the major entries. Resident Evil 7 was fantastic, but right before that, you had the release of Resident Evil 6, and that was an absolute train wreck. Just a lot of questionable decisions with that game, but it's been so many years since then, and I think Resident Evil as a franchise is starting to find its footing once again. Revelations was great. I thought Revelations 2, while being an episodic and smaller game, I thought that was pretty good as well. As I mentioned, Resident Evil 7 was really great, a little bit different than your traditional Resident Evil game, but definitely brought that atmosphere of survival horror. And now we have the incoming release of the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's out in just a few days. And again, as I mentioned at the top, the anticipation and hype of this game right now is absolutely staggering, and that's for a variety of different reasons. But let's go back to the initial announcement of Resident Evil 2, because if you go back to then, when Capcom just dropped the information, hey, we're working on a Resident Evil 2 remake, but they didn't really add much to that. They just said that was a game that was coming, and that was coming off of the Resident Evil 1 release, which had a pretty good reception, but then they announced the Resident Evil 2 remake. And yes, while I would say that there was a subsect of gamers excited for that remake, comparing the hype back then to the hype now, it is a far cry. The hype right now, a few days ahead of its release, far exceeds the amount of hype there was when it was initially announced. And me saying that, I have to give Capcom a lot of credit, because with a lot of games, you'll see them be announced for a very long time, and by the time they're ready to be released, the anticipation and the hype actually dissipates as you see more and more of the game, as they shove more footage and gameplay down your throat. We've seen that in the past with games, but credit to the Resident Evil 2 remake, it's just been this slow build-up process, and the great thing about it is when it had its official unveiling at E3 of last year, that's when the hype really got rolling. But again, going back to that initial announcement, I think the reason gamers weren't overly excited for the game was just because they heard Resident Evil 2 remake, and maybe in this age of so many remasters and re-releases, they thought, hey, this is really cool, I'll be able to check out Resident Evil 2 again, but they didn't get the magnitude of what this really was gonna be. Then again, the anticipation and the hype really kicked up at E3 when we finally saw footage of it, and then it began to be evident, holy crap, this is a full-on remake, ground up. Visually, it is absolutely stunning. This isn't just a typical remaster, this isn't a lazy remake, this is a full-on remake built for current gen hardware, but at the same time, it's staying true to Resident Evil 2's roots and trying to do that game justice, which I commend Capcom for. Okay, so by E3 of 2018, we figured out that the Resident Evil 2 remake was gonna be, well, a full-on remake, and that was very exciting to people that knew of Resident Evil 2. But what is it about Resident Evil 2 specifically that had gamers so excited? Well, if you look back on the game and you look at reviews, it's sitting at a very impressive 89 on Metacritic. That's a very good score, but an 89 in this day and age, that's not something that is completely heralded upon. You see games well over 90. Look at games like Red Dead Redemption 2, God of War, all of the Nintendo releases. This day and age, they throw out 95s and perfect scores left and right, and an 89, while that's a very respectable score, in 2019, that'd be like, okay, that's a good game I'll check out, but what makes Resident Evil 2 so iconic? Well, first of all, that 89 Metascore was all the way back in 1998, and honestly speaking, I do believe that review scores have been curved a little bit, meaning that comparatively speaking, from 1998 to 2019, it's a lot easier to get, say, a 9 or a 10 out of 10 even in 2019 compared to what it was in 1998. You very rarely saw perfect scores being thrown around, and I'll even give you guys an example. Specifically on the GameSpot review, they gave the game an 8.9, a very good score right on that Metacritic average, and this was the quote Metacritic took from the game specifically about Resident Evil 2. The original release, mind you, quote, one of the most entertaining games I've ever played. With its unique camera angles, storyline, graphics, sound effects, and music, RE2 seems more like a product out of Hollywood than the video game industry. Now, me taking that snippet and just throwing it at your face with no review score, you would think that quote is coming from a game that was reviewed at, say, a 9.2 to a 9.5, but it was reviewed at an 8.9. I know that's not a big disparity, but just keep that in mind. IGN also gave the game a 9.3, so the game got very positive review scores, but over the years, it's just been looked back upon as this iconic horror game that really revolutionized horror video games. For all the reasons GameSpot mentioned right there, it was a very cinematic game for its time period, the storyline was excellent, and I even remember back then, Resident Evil 2, people would look at that game and be like, this is a visual masterclass for the PlayStation 1, so that game had a lot going for it back then, and it also had a lot of cool secrets and a lot of cool elements. Like, I'll just point to that tofu thing. I thought the tofu thing was great. It's that hidden secret that's such a cool tidbit to add into any game. It's just the little things that game did really, really well, and then it's also a game that so many gamers are nostalgic about. While if you look at the entirety of the Resident Evil franchise, I do believe the majority of gamers would say Resident Evil 4 is the best game in the franchise, maybe because Resident Evil 4 was a big blockbuster success. You could even argue that that was the game that brought Resident Evil to a more mainstream audience, especially with its more action-focused gameplay, and I can definitely understand that, but for those ardent survival horror fans, Resident Evil 2 was that game. And to see it come back all these years later, over 20 years to be exact, that's exciting in its own right. But Resident Evil 2, the remake, it's not just bringing back Resident Evil with all of those classic elements. While I said yes, it is staying true to its roots, it's bringing back the essence of Resident Evil 2, but it's also modernizing it for a newer audience. Because yes, while gamers like me and a lot of you guys that played Resident Evil 2, you'll just inherently be excited for the game, there's gonna be a large majority of gamers that are coming into Resident Evil 2 for the first time, and they have done a variety of different changes to make the game more accessible to modern audiences. For example, Leon no longer wears large shoulder pads, which were added to distinguish his original low polygon model. You had the removal of the fixed camera angles in the remake. The team had to use different ways to conceal enemies using elements such as room layout, lighting, and smoke. So a lot of different variables come into play with the gameplay, making the gameplay, at least I would expect, have a lot more depth to it. And we'll talk a little bit about my experiences with the game because of course we all played the one-shot demo, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The new camera system also affected the sound design, as it no longer made sense for sound to come from a fixed source. So a lot of different changes are coming to the game, but it's just upping the standard and the quality of the game, given the fact that, again, it's been north of 20 years since RE2 was released. As great as that game is, for a lot of us, we can go back and enjoy that game even on the PlayStation 1. For the majority of people, you need some fresh takes, and you need that modernization in this game. However, if you do want to play the game closer to its original incarnation, there's an optional auto-aim mode which locks onto enemy weak points when aiming at them rather than relying on your own ability, which is an element of the game if you play it the standard way, but if you do want to play it that way as well, they're trying to give you a couple of different options when playing the game, and I can definitely respect that. And again, harkening back to the original Resident Evil 2, another cool inclusion in this game is the fact that the minigame modes will be back for the remake, and you're getting both the Fourth Survivor and Tofu modes. That'll be included in the game. I don't know how much captivation that's gonna offer to new gamers, but that's a very cool throwback to those of us that did play RE2. And again, as I mentioned a little bit ago, this is a game that I feel like Capcom is so confident with, the development studio behind this game is very confident with, that they even went ahead releasing a one-shot demo. Now, that demo did limit you in only playing 30 minutes of a section of the game, and you only had one shot in doing so, but that 30 minutes, and I'm sure some of you guys manipulated it and got a lot more than 30 minutes of playtime, but nonetheless, even just playing it for 30 minutes, you can see that the essence of Resident Evil 2 is absolutely still there, but man, oh man, is the quality also there. This feels like a modern third-person shooter, and the gore, I cannot say enough about that. They did not cut any corners with that. This is as visceral and gruesome of a game that Resident Evil has ever been, and taking it to 2019, it gets even better. Now, I'm not just gonna say positive superlative after positive superlative, because I think there is one area that some gamers might have an issue with. This generation of gaming, I think there's been a big emphasis on quantity, having a lot of content in your game, and let's be real, we know what Resident Evil 2 is. Capcom has talked about this in length, but if you're looking to spend your $60 and get a game that is gonna offer you, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of hours of gameplay, you're not gonna be getting that out of the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's just not gonna happen. We know the content that's in the game, and Capcom has came out and said there's gonna be two scenarios in the game, one where you play as Leon Kennedy, the other one Claire Redfield. If you take your time, they're each gonna be about 10 hours long, so you can complete the game in, you know, 18 to 20 hours. And in 2019, 18 to 20 hours of gameplay for your $60 doesn't seem like a lot of content, but in the case of Resident Evil 2, this is a game that absolutely emphasizes quality over quantity, and quantity-wise, it's not like this is gonna be a 2-hour game, although if you know Resident Evil 2 in and out, you know all of the sections, you know how to get through everything, honestly, you can probably beat the game pretty quickly. There were people that even beat the one-shot demo. They gave you 30 minutes, but there were people beating that in 3 minutes. So just know this is a game that's being tailor-made with RE2 in mind. It's not like they're adding a ton of new content. I'm sure there are going to be some new inclusions here or there, but as I've been mentioning, the essence of the game is still there, and if you know the game in and out, if you played it 100 times through, which some people honestly have, you're going to be able to beat the remake rather quickly. And I've actually noticed a lot of people say, I'm going to wait on a sale for this one because I know Resident Evil 2 in and out, and I don't want to spend $60 on a game that I can beat very, very quickly, and I can understand it from that sense. But if you're a newcomer, or you haven't played Resident Evil 2 in a very long time like me, it's gonna be a very fresh experience. And if you did play Resident Evil 2 all those times, if you did beat it like 100 times, you probably like the game so much that you're gonna check it out anyway, just because you're such a big fan of Resident Evil 2, and to see the game remade at this quality level, it's mind-boggling to say the least. Now, one aspect of the game that did disappoint me a little bit personally, the last main Resident Evil game that we saw released had a great VR component as well. Some people preferred to play the game with the traditional DualShock 4 controls, but having that additional VR element to the game, I thought that was great. Unfortunately, the RE2 remake won't be having that, but hey, for the style of game that it is, I can kind of understand it. But could you imagine going through the Resident Evil 2 remake in VR? That would have been pretty epic. Unfortunately, that won't be happening with this one. Hopefully sometime down the line, Capcom does revisit Resident Evil with a VR layer, because I still think that has a lot of potential in creating more VR experiences in the Resident Evil world. But that's gonna conclude this video. I hope I offered you guys a lot of information on the RE2 remake. So many gamers are excited for this game, and not to give a slight to Kingdom Hearts 3, that intro was just me hyping up RE2. Kingdom Hearts 3 is a big game, and we're gonna be talking all about that ahead of its release as well. That's coming up soon. But the Resident Evil 2 remake is out January 25th. Where are you at? Are you gonna be picking up this game day one? Did you play the one-shot demo? And if you did, what did you think of it? Or are you on the boat of, hey, I played RE2 so many times, I know the game in and out. For my $60, it would be a relatively short experience. I'm gonna wait on this one because I have said that notion thrown out here and there. That's gonna wrap up this one. Sound off with all of your thoughts in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and if you're already subscribed, do us a favor and hit the bell icon. This way you'll be notified whenever we post a new video. That's the best way to keep up with all of our uploads, and we usually try to upload 2 videos a day. And with the bell icon hit, you'll be notified whenever we do upload a video. As always, thanks for watching.